June 10th, 1190. A river in the mountains of what is now Turkey, and a 67-year-old man on a horse, crossing what should have been a perfectly ordinary ford. The horse stumbled, the current caught it, and the most powerful man in Europe went under. They laid him on the bank. The spring sun was still shining, birds were still singing in the mountains, and the river kept moving, completely indifferent to what it had just taken from history. For a long moment, no one in that army spoke, because every man standing on that riverbank understood what it meant. Not just that the emperor was dead, but that everything, every mile, every battle, every man who had died in the passes and the plains and the walls of Iconium was over. And with him died the largest, most feared Crusader army ever assembled. 20,000 men, 6 months of marching, 2 impossible victories, all of it over because of a river crossing. His crown is still down there at the bottom of the Seljuk River. No one ever found it, and the question that has haunted historians ever since is this: how does a man who survived 40 years of warfare die like that? The answer takes us back 8 months to a city that changed everything. October 2nd, 1187. 88 years of Christian control, gone in a single afternoon. Saladin took the city. He was merciful by the standards of holy war. The population was allowed to ransom themselves, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was not burned. But Jerusalem was no longer Christian, and that fact sent shockwaves across the entire known world. Thousands walked out of those gates that month. Most of them had been born inside those walls. They had no other home, and now they had nowhere to go. The news reached Rome in weeks. The Pope did not sleep that night. He sat alone with a candle, and he wrote, Audita Tremendi, hearing the terrible. The document that would launch the Third Crusade. It went to every Christian king in Europe, and the message was simple. Take the cross, or history will never forgive you. 3 kings answered. Philip of France, young, calculating, always 3 moves ahead. Richard of England, the Lionheart, fierce, impatient, allergic to caution. And then the 3rd king, the oldest, the most experienced, the one Saladin spies reported back on with a single word: dangerous. Frederick Barbarossa put the letter down. He had been fighting for Christendom since before Philip of France was born. He had ruled the Holy Roman Empire for 37 years, and he had never lost a campaign. He was not about to start now. Spring 1189, Regensburg, Germany. And here's the first thing you need to understand. Barbarossa didn't raise an army, he raised a nation. 3,000 knights, the finest heavy cavalry in the Christian world, men whose entire lives had been training for exactly this moment. But that was just the beginning. 15,000 infantry behind them. Men who would walk on foot across an entire continent. Men whose names history would never record because they would be too busy dying in ditches so the knights could charge. 20,000 men total. The single largest Crusader force ever assembled in European history. And at its head, a 67-year-old emperor who rode like he was 30 and fought like the devil himself had something to prove. When Saladin received the intelligence report, he didn't sleep for 3 days. At the Hungarian border, 2,000 more horsemen joined them. Prince Géza, brother of the Hungarian king, young, ambitious, desperate to make a name that would echo down the centuries. Remember him. His story doesn't end where you expect. 22,000 men, marching east, the Danube, their guide. The road to Jerusalem, somewhere over the horizon, and absolutely nothing between them and glory. Or so they thought. The Balkans. And here's something the history books gloss over. The enemy that nearly broke this army never drew a single weapon. The passes were like this. Single file, hundreds of feet of drop on one side, loose stone under every boot. Men fell, horses broke their legs. Supply wagons full of weeks of food plunged into gorges and were gone. The mountains took their toll as efficiently as any army, and the tribes watched from the ridges. They didn't attack the main column, because 20,000 armed men is not something you attack directly. But stragglers vanished. Foragers rode out in the morning and simply did not come back. The Balkans bled the army quietly, and by the time they came out the other side, the men who emerged were different men. Harder, less certain, and about to face something far worse than mountains. The Byzantine Empire. A Christian empire, an ally, or so the Crusaders believed. What actually happened next is one of the most extraordinary betrayals in medieval history, and almost no one talks about it. Emperor Isaac II of Byzantium sent a messenger. Safe passage guaranteed, supplies waiting on the road, complete cooperation. His words were honey. While that messenger was still riding west, Isaac's envoys were already riding east to Saladin's camp with everything. The size of the army, the route, the supply lines, the timeline. Isaac II, emperor of a Christian empire, handed the entire plan to the Muslim sultan to protect himself. And Saladin received it with something that might have been gratitude. Saladin now knew everything, and he had time to prepare. What he couldn't prepare for was Barbarossa's response to the betrayal. Because Barbarossa didn't negotiate, he didn't send diplomatic letters. He did what he always did. Philippopolis, a Byzantine city, had closed its gates. Barbarossa looked at those gates for perhaps 30 seconds, then he raised his hand. One day, the city fell before the sun set. He was not cruel. The population was not harmed, but the message that traveled ahead of him was clear. Betray this army, and you will not enjoy the consequences. Isaac still didn't learn. He sent 2,000 horsemen into a narrow pass ahead, a textbook ambush, perfect ground, perfect angles, and Barbarossa sent 5,000 cavalry at them before they'd finished setting up. The Byzantines broke, and Isaac, watching his options collapse one by one, finally did what he should have done from the beginning. He signed the treaty. He granted the passage he'd promised all along. And Barbarossa took it, knowing it meant nothing, and marched east. They crossed the Hellespont into Asia, and behind them, Europe disappeared. Ahead, nothing familiar, nothing welcoming, and a Turkish sultan who now knew exactly where they were, exactly where they were going, exactly how to make sure they never arrived. Asia Minor in summer. And here's what Isaac's intelligence gift to Saladin actually meant in practice. The rivers were dry, not naturally. The Turks had been ahead of them, poisoning wells, burning fodder, salting grazing land. The entire landscape had been weaponized. The army was being bled, not in battle, but in thirst and hunger and heat, mile by agonizing mile. Turkish scouts watched from every ridge, patient, counting, waiting for the moment when the Crusaders were at their weakest. And that moment was coming. But so was the moment that no one, not the Turks, not Saladin, not history, saw coming. 10,000 Seljuk soldiers, assembled on the plain of Philomelion. Their orders were simple. Stop the Crusaders here, before they reach Iconium, before they reach the capital. Because if Barbarossa reaches Iconium, the Sultanate of Rum is finished. Barbarossa looked at 10,000 Turks across the plain. He had 20,000 men, but half of them were exhausted infantry and supply drivers, so his effective fighting force was perhaps 5,000 cavalry. The odds were not good. He attacked immediately. The lances hit the Turkish line and the world shook. It bent, it buckled, and then 10,000 men turned and ran. The largest Turkish force in Asia Minor, assembled specifically to stop this crusade, scattered into the hills like smoke. The road to Iconium was open, and Prince Giza, who had ridden across a continent to make his name, rode back from that battlefield with blood on his saber, and the look of a man who had just understood what war actually was. The Crusader army arrived at Iconium, capital of the Sultanate of Rum, the heart of Turkish power in Asia Minor. High walls, full garrison, every defender knowing that if this city fell, their world ended. And Barbarossa looked at those walls and did something that stunned everyone watching. He didn't lay siege, because sieges take weeks, months. And he didn't have that kind of time. He attacked that same day. The ladders went up, the arrows came down, men died climbing, and the ones behind them kept climbing anyway. Somewhere in that press of bodies and arrows and burning pitch, the wall tipped. One Crusader standard appeared on the battlements, then another. Then the gates collapsed inward, and Iconium burned. Frederick Barbarossa rode through the gates of the Turkish capital. He had crossed a continent. He had beaten the Byzantines. He had destroyed the Turkish army. He had taken their capital city. And Jerusalem was 3 weeks away. For the first time since Regensburg, he allowed himself to believe it. He was actually going to do this. The Taurus Mountains, June 1190. The army was moving fast now, confident, battle-hardened, 3 weeks from the Mediterranean coast. From there, ships to the Holy Land, and from there, Jerusalem. The mood in the column, for the first time in months, was something close to joy. And Barbarossa let himself feel it, the loosening of something that had been tight in his chest since the day the letter arrived. They had done it, all of it, the impossible march, the impossible victories. And Jerusalem was close enough to taste. And then they came to the Salathi River. The Salathi River, a mountain stream, cold with snowmelt, but fordable, the kind of crossing an army makes a dozen times on a long march. No one in the column gave it a second thought, and that was the problem. The spring melt had changed the riverbed. The current was running faster than it looked from the bank, deeper than it looked, at angles that made the footing treacherous in ways you could not see until you were already in it. Hundreds of soldiers had already crossed that morning without incident, which is exactly why no one warned the emperor. The horse stepped in, and the current grabbed it harder than expected. The horse stumbled on the stones, and Frederick Barbarossa, the man who had survived 40 years of warfare, who had fought popes and emperors and sultans, went sideways into the water. In full armor in a cold mountain current. His knights were in the water within seconds, and they had his hand, but it was too late. The armor that had protected him in 40 battles pulled him straight to the bottom. They laid him on the bank. The spring sun was still shining. Birds were still singing in the mountains, and the river kept moving, completely indifferent to what it had just taken from history. For a long moment, no one in that army spoke, because every man standing on that riverbank understood what it meant. Not just that the emperor was dead, but that everything, every man who had died in the passes and the plains and the walls of Iconium was over. Prince Yeza stood at the edge of the river and looked at the emperor's body. He had followed this man from Hungary across the Balkans, through Byzantium, across Asia Minor, through 2 impossible battles. 6 months, 1,000 miles, and Jerusalem was 21 days away. He looked at the road ahead and made a decision. Most of the army turned back. They had come to follow Frederick Barbarossa, and Barbarossa was gone. Without him, the crusade had no center, no gravity, and they had not marched across a continent to follow a prince. Germany went home. But some of them couldn't. 5,000 men kept marching, a fraction of what had left Regensburg. Prince Yeza at the front, not because he was the greatest leader, not because he had a plan, but because he had come too far, paid too much, and he would not turn back now. They reached Antioch. They had survived, they had made it. But the crusade they had come to fight was already being fought by other kings. Richard and Philip were besieging Acre without them, and the German army, the force Saladin had spent months dreading, arrived too late to change anything. When Saladin received the news of Barbarossa's death, he wept, not from grief, from relief. He later told his advisors, and this is documented, that he had believed, genuinely believed, that if Frederick Barbarossa reached Jerusalem, he could not have held it. The one man he feared, gone, because of a river. History sometimes turns on the strangest hinges. Prince Yeza eventually reached Jerusalem, not as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim. He knelt at the tomb of Christ, the tomb that had started all of this, alone, in a city that was still under Saladin's crescent. The city that 22,000 men had marched across the world to take was still exactly where they had left it. And Prince Yeza, who had wanted a story to tell in halls for 100 years, had one. Just not the story he had expected. Barbarossa's body was boiled to separate the flesh from the bones, so the bones could be transported home. His flesh was buried in Antioch. His bones went to Germany, and his dream lies somewhere at the bottom of the Taurus mountains, in a river that never knew what it had taken. Saladin kept Jerusalem. Richard the Lionheart went home without taking it. Philip went home early, and Barbarossa, the one man who might have changed everything, drowned before he ever saw the walls. The Third Crusade failed, and the city that launched 1,000 ships and 20,000 soldiers in 6 months of impossible marching remained exactly where it was, unchanged, unmoved, warm in the sun. Frederick Barbarossa sleeps in Spire Cathedral. Stone crown, stone sword, stone eagle at his feet. He did not reach Jerusalem, but he crossed a continent to try, and defeated every army and every empire that stood in his way, and was stopped by nothing more than a river. At the wrong moment, in the wrong season, with the wrong curse. And I don't know if that makes it more tragic or more human. The river still flows, cold in spring, silver in the sun. No monument, no plaque, no stone with his name. Just water moving over stones, the way it has for 800 years, indifferent to the crown still lying somewhere beneath it. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe to Empires Untold. Because history is full of men like Barbarossa, men who almost changed everything, and their stories deserve to be told.